Lord of Mysteries. My Identities echoes across time chapter 351 to 360. Artisan was not afraid of Lynn and the others being exposed. What he feared was that his attempt to deceive the eternal blazing sun would be revealed. If that happened, he, a sequence one who wasn't good at combat, would be finished. It was known that there were 4 gods at this banquet: the eternal blazing sun, the Evernight goddess, Trunsost, and the Lord of Storms. Even though the Evernight goddess was secretly their ally, the other 3 were formidable, not to mention the angels and saints present. Although he trusted Lynn's abilities, Artisan was genuinely terrified that if something unexpected happened and Lynn got held up, he would be doomed. Nothing. Akasis shook his head and looked at the Angel of Crafts, continuing the previous topic. Are you really planning to prematurely accommodate the uniqueness of the Paragon? Yes. Artisan's plan to lure the eternal blazing sun out and ensure he carried the uniqueness of the Paragon was to inform him that he intended to accommodate the uniqueness early and become Paragon. Theoretically, this was feasible, requiring only a simplified version of the Paragon promotion ceremony. So, Artisan, without changing his expression, continued, I have no choice. The world is becoming more dangerous, and if I don't find a way to improve myself, I feel it will be very perilous. At this point, Artisan thought of the beating he had taken and sincerely sighed. I happen to have a very cost-effective opportunity to complete the ceremony to accommodate the uniqueness of the Paragon, so I plan to give it a try. Hearing this, Akasis glanced at Artisan without any surprise at his cowardly demeanor. The Angel of Crafts was such a timid person that if it weren't for his weak and easily manipulated nature, Akasis might not have chosen to support him to become a Paragon. Therefore, he did not doubt much about Artisan's decision to accommodate the uniqueness of the Paragon early out of fear of death, or rather, Akasis might have had some doubts, but he couldn't imagine that in just a few days, the previously ambitious Artisan had already obediently started preparing to work for Lynn. Moreover, Akasis hadn't remembered much about Lynn. Like others, he had obtained memories of interacting with Lynn, but crucial information about Lynn remained vague, just as it had been for Medici before meeting Lynn in person. The information he had about Lynn was also blurry. Akasis was merely curious and cautious, inquiring about Mr. Door's son, Libert Abraham, and gathering intelligence in this regard, but he hadn't connected the dots. Thus, he was easily fooled by Artisan. After taking a sip of wine, he said, I can give you the Paragon uniqueness early, but I need to witness your accommodation personally. If you fail, I will reclaim this uniqueness. This will also prevent any unnecessary accidents. Fine. Artisan nodded without hesitation, speaking with a somewhat timid tone. I'm also afraid of any accidents. With you there, at least I can feel more at ease. This was the truth because if he couldn't trick the eternal blazing sun out, he wouldn't be able to explain to Lynn. Having him around did make him feel more secure. Hey. Akasis, unaware of what his seemingly reliable, weak, and easily manipulated ally was thinking, sneered and then noticed the host of the banquet, the Night Emperor Trunsost, and his queen finally making their grand entrance. He downed his wine and approached the Night Emperor to greet him. I thought you weren't going to attend this banquet tonight, Akasis said with a warm smile, which belied his capacity for betrayal, and his significant role in limiting Trunsost among the 6 gods. Sorry, I had to deal with a minor issue, so I was delayed, Trunsost replied with a smile. His gaze swept across the 6 gods present, including the Evernight goddess, the Lord of Storms, and the eternal blazing sun before him, and seemed to linger on Artisan a few steps away. He said calmly. Tonight's banquet is livelier than I expected. I didn't think so many people would come. Tisk. Hearing this, Akasis clicked his tongue, as if recalling something, and said, Isn't it because of the recent events involving Libert Abraham? Everyone is keen to take this opportunity to discuss about him. Akasis's words were not false. Normally, the Night Emperor and his queen's wedding anniversary banquet wouldn't attract so many high-ranking figures. The reason so many came tonight was largely due to Lynn's recent activities, which had made everyone tense, so they took this opportunity to gather and talk. Libert Abraham. Trunsost murmured the name, showing appropriate curiosity and contemplation, saying, I've heard a lot about him recently, but I still don't know what kind of individual he is. His expression was naturally perfect, as if he hadn't just met Lynn moments ago. He's not a simple character. Akasis shook his head. After a few more exchanges, Trunsost casually asked, I saw you talking with the Angel of Crafts earlier. were you discussing Libert Abraham? Upon hearing this, Akas's expression remained unchanged, still with that warm smile, and he nodded. We did talk about some matters related to him. Though, in reality, their conversation hadn't touched upon Libert Abraham at all, it didn't stop Akas's from saying so. The superficial alliances among the 6 gods were evident in this moment. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Trunsost, whether he saw through the eternal blazing sun's concealment or not, simply smiled and said, "It seems that Libert Abraham is more like the host of today's banquet than I am." His tone carried a hint of teasing, as well as a touch of resignation. Well, he'd have to attend the banquet first. Though, the host of this banquet will always be you and Awarnia, Akasas shrugged and replied. Trunsost chuckled upon hearing this, then said, "I'll go greet the Evernight Goddess and the Lord of Storms. We'll talk later." Akasas didn't mind this at all. He waved his hand to signal Trunsost to go, then added, "I have something to attend to tonight. I might leave early, so don't mind me." "So, it's really you," Trunsost muttered in his heart. Although he had already guessed it, he couldn't help but feel genuinely happy when the result was confirmed. There wasn't any special reason, mainly he just wanted to see the eternal blazing sun in trouble. If it were any other of the 6 gods, the Trunsost might have been a bit worried, but not for him. He didn't have the leisure to sympathize with him, especially since the eternal blazing sun and the god of combat had always restricted him the most, practically wanting to turn him into a puppet. Thus, with a smile, Trunsost approached the Evernight Goddess and exchanged a few pleasantries. "It's rare to see you at a banquet. I remember you don't usually like such occasions." "I don't, but sometimes one needs to get out and about, right?" Amonizes responded with a smile. After exchanging a few more words, they parted ways with smiles. The Night Emperor Trunsost then had to greet the Lord of Storms, all while pondering a bit more. The Evernight Goddess seems to know. The eternal blazing sun was going to have a bad time today? Trunsost refrained from looking at the trio in the corner who were eating, drinking, and teasing tiny Amon. Soon, he approached the Lord of Storms, who was drinking alone. After exchanging pleasantries, Trunsost chatted briefly with the other high-sequence attendees, but a part of his attention remained on the eternal blazing sun's movements. Finally, Trunsost noticed the eternal blazing sun leaving the banquet hall, accompanied by the god of crafts. He also noticed that the trio in the corner, eating and teasing tiny Amon, had vanished. "It's starting," Trunsost murmured, and seconds later, he indeed sensed a disturbance. Not far from the palace, the eternal blazing sun's aura flared for a moment before disappearing. Space transference. It must be the work of Mr. Door. Trunsost assessed the situation. He calmed the high-sequence guests who also sensed the disturbance, then headed towards the source of the vanished aura. Due to his deal with Lynn, Trunsost didn't plan to rescue anyone. As Lynn had said, he intended to watch. Watch and see what Libert Abraham could do and what made him special. As he moved, Trunsost noticed the Evernight Goddess and the Lord of Storms also heading out. Both seemed to be in no hurry, not keen on rescuing anyone. Perhaps it was a coincidence, but the 3 Sequence 0 beings exchanged glances, and an understanding formed. "So, you're also here to watch. This is Trunsost. When did you start colluding with Lynn? This is Amonizes. So, we're really not rescuing anyone? This is the Lord of Storms." If Akasas, currently being beaten up by Lynn, knew what his good friends were thinking and doing, he'd probably feel quite touched. Meanwhile, as the Night Emperor Trunsost, the Evernight Goddess, and the Lord of Storms leisurely made their way to the scene, intending to watch rather than rescue, the eternal blazing sun finally faced Lynn in a sealed spirit world. "It's you," Akas's pupils quaked. Like everyone else, upon seeing Lynn, the fog in his memory cleared. He recognized Lynn and saw Bethel beside him, instantly realizing another truth. Lynn was Libert Abraham. So that's it. No wonder Evernight and others behaved so strangely. Damn, not one of them warned me. Akasas felt like cursing, but in the outside remained extremely calm. He focused on Lynn and said, "I don't think we have any grudges between us." "How so? Did you forget you backstabbed the ancient sun god and caused Sasrir to fall?" Lynn said with a smile. As he spoke, He snapped his fingers, and Akas's expression changed drastically. Lynn continued, and a friendly reminder, don't try any tricks in front of me. I'm not blind. Akas's quickly said, I know you're strong, but using that kind of power comes with a price, doesn't it? I am a sequence 0 after all. Killing me isn't easy. There's no need to pay such a heavy price for a dead person. I think we can talk. I'm willing to atone for my past mistakes. Ha! Lynn chuckled, tilting his head slightly as he looked at Akas's, speaking slowly. First, I don't think we have anything to talk about. Second, if you're stalling for time, waiting for someone to save you, don't bother. Time here flows differently from the outside. We have plenty of time to settle old scores before your allies arrive. And all your allies are my allies. Even if they're flimsy allies, they all enjoy watching you suffer. Lynn added in his heart. Though he wanted to flaunt this, Lynn, being a reliable ally, had a sense of secrecy and wouldn't betray anyone. Akas's had no idea that his 3 closest rescuers were all traitors, but Lynn's words made his expression change. He realized stalling here was indeed futile. But you don't need to worry, I don't plan to kill you. Just as Akas's was about to fight to the death, he heard Lynn say this. The young angel's smile was warm and bright, with a touch of youthful innocence. I just want to beat you up and take the Paragon's uniqueness. Maybe you should try not to resist. End of chapter. Maybe you should try not to resist? Lynn's words were undoubtedly serious. He really didn't intend to kill Akas's. This traitor wasn't worth the effort. But it was clear that Akas's wasn't going to stop resisting just because of Lynn's words. He was never the type to let others decide his fate. Or rather, Akas's didn't fully trust Lynn. He feared that giving up resistance would result in being effortlessly killed. However, Lynn's words weren't completely ineffective. Although Akas's did resist, it was clear he wasn't fighting desperately. He was caught between not fully believing Lynn and holding onto a bit of hope. After all, not only would it cost Lynn a significant effort to kill Akas's, but if Akas's fought desperately using his trump cards, it would also cost him dearly. Under these circumstances, without a real sense of life-threatening danger, Akas's maintained only a limited resistance. Simply put, he resisted, but not too much. It was just enough to avoid making Lynn pay too high a price, but still very frustrating, making Lynn feel that not giving Akas's a thorough beating would be a loss. One has to admit, Akas's had a knack for putting himself in such situations. Because of this, when Trunsost, the Evernight goddess, and the Lord of Storms arrived late, just in time to witness the end of the incident, what they saw was Akas's sprawled on the ground, battered and bloody, with a golden sack torn open on his head. His handsome face was swollen like a pig's head. Akas's wasn't unconscious. He was just lying there. Judging from the positions of his limbs, it seemed like every possible bone was broken. Of course, this didn't mean the Sequence 0 had completely lost his ability to fight back. Despite being severely injured, as a mythical creature, Akas's still had the ability to launch a desperate counterattack or even escape at a great cost if Lynn truly intended to kill him. Never underestimate the survival abilities of a Sequence 0. Not everyone is god of combat. Akas's lay there like a dead dog because he realized it was the most cost-effective approach. Lynn, a mysterious figure suspected of existing across multiple timelines, with immense combat power and possibly a vessel for the revival of some great entity, surprisingly only wanted to steal the uniqueness of the Paragon and beat him up a bit. Honestly, although Akas's had harbored a glimmer of hope from the start, the fact before him still left him dumbfounded. Lynn could see through Akas's thoughts, but he didn't care. After giving Akas's a thorough beating, Lynn, feeling refreshed, stretched lazily and casually looked at the 3 gods who had arrived late. He smiled and said, "Since you all are here now, I'll leave him to you. I suggest finding the Earth Mother to treat him. Although it won't heal these wounds, it might reduce his pain." Lynn was speaking the truth. Although the wounds on Akas's seemed like ordinary injuries, each spot Lynn had hit contained a trace of Time's power. This was a new skill Lynn had developed. The principle was complex and hard to explain, but the effect was simple. It could fix a certain state on a living being without involving the soul. For example, if he used this skill on an 18-year-old girl, her appearance would remain 18 for a century or so. As for Akas's, the fixed state was naturally his injuries. As a Sequence 0 with various extraordinary abilities, the fixed injuries wouldn't last a century, but they would be enough to make him suffer for a while. Lynn, I think we need an explanation, Ammonizes said calmly after glancing at the badly injured Occuses. Why are you here, and why did you seriously injure the eternal blazing sun? Ammonizes, known for helping Lilith deceive and pit god of combat, didn't disappoint. Although she was directly involved in the plan to beat up the eternal blazing sun and steal the Paragon's uniqueness, she could still ask these questions without batting an eye. Of the gods present, only Occuses wasn't aware of the close relationship between Ammonizes and Lynn. So, when Ammonizes spoke, Trunsost remained expressionless, thoughtfully looking at the eternal blazing sun on the ground. The Lord of Storms hesitated, glancing at the Evernight goddess several times, wanting to say something but holding back. Of course, I came here as a tourist, just settling old scores with the eternal blazing sun and taking what's mine, Lynn said with a smile, even spreading his hands innocently. You all arrived so aggressively, you almost scared me. There was a few seconds of silence after Lynn spoke. Even Azek, who had been holding the cage with tiny Amon throughout the whole incident, found Lynn's words too outrageous at that moment. Fortunately, everyone present, except for the unfortunate Occuses, had some relationship with Lynn. Even if they didn't, like Trunsost, they had interacted with Lynn and made some deals. Everyone had a certain understanding of Lynn's character. After a few seconds of awkward silence, Ammonizes continued calmly. I hope we didn't leave a bad impression. However, Lynn, I must state that the six gods are an alliance. We always stand together. So, no matter what grievances you have with the eternal blazing sun, we cannot stand idly by. I hope you understand. If this happens again, the six gods will fully oppose you. Lynn almost burst out laughing. He blinked, trying to hold back his laughter, and after a few seconds, said, if he doesn't provoke me again, I think there won't be a next time. I'm a very good-tempered person. I never hit people casually. Ammonizes didn't comment on that. The Lord of Storms turned his head, possibly to hide his expression. Trunsost's gaze remained on the eternal blazing sun, his lips twitching slightly. Azek looked down at tiny Amon in the cage, thought for a moment, and said nothing. Artisan looked around, seemingly distracted by something interesting. Bethel, skilled at ignoring Lynn's nonsense, just glanced at the location of Trunsost Empire's palace and reminded, others are arriving soon. End of chapter. It seems the time for farewells has finally arrived. Lynn also glanced in that direction before smiling at the three deities present. His gaze first met that of Ammonizes before settling on Trunsost. The Emperor of the Justiciar pathway appeared calm on the surface, but Lynn, being who he was, could easily see through the facade. Beneath Trunsost's composed exterior, his thoughts were in turmoil. What the fuck? The eternal blazing sun was beaten down like a dog. What exactly is Lynn? In 3 days, I'll arrange for Bethel and Antigonus to have a conversation with you. Lynn's voice echoed in Trunsost's ear. Aside from him, no one else could hear it. Trunsost's eyes flickered, but he neither spoke nor made any other gestures. Though the Evernight goddess and the Lord of Storms were aware that he had cozied up to Lynn, and even though they themselves had unclear relations with Lynn, the eternal blazing sun was still an outsider, and Trunsost was very aware that the six gods would never agree to him switching his allegiance. In fact, although Trunsost's desire to change patrons had been easily guessed by Lynn, Bethel, and others, it was primarily because Lynn immediately recognized Amon, had knowledge of Trunsost's inevitable fallout with the six gods, and possessed the ability to discern people's hearts. In such circumstances, no secret, no matter how great, could truly remain hidden. However, to others, this was still a well-kept secret. The six gods were not constantly watching Trunsost's retinue, so they hadn't noticed Amon's presence. And under normal conditions, no one would ever imagine that Trunsost, who had been supported by the six gods and had become deeply intertwined with them, would want to switch sides. Even in this world, where alliances among high-ranking entities constantly form and break, this was too shocking. However, Trunsost glanced at the Evernight goddess standing quietly, then nonchalantly looked away. Among the six gods, Trunsost was sure the others hadn't guessed his thoughts or noticed his actions, but he wasn't so certain about Ammonizes. This goddess, who wielded the authority of secrets, had always been the most enigmatic. Trunsost rarely understood what she was thinking or how many trump cards and allies she had, or what schemes she harbored. The only certainty was that their relationship was neither close nor distant. They were collaborators, allies, but nothing more. In fact, even among the 6 gods, the only one who had an overtly good relationship with the Evernight goddess was the Lord of Storms. The powerful but not very bright Lord of Storms often followed the Evernight goddess's lead, either to perform certain tasks or avoid some troubles. So, regarding Lynn's statement that the Augustus family, under the support of the Evernight goddess, the Lord of Storms, and an unknown deity, replaced the Trunsost royal family, Trunsost wasn't surprised. Though he had no grudge against the Evernight goddess, he knew that when the time came for the Trunsost royal family to disappear, this goddess wouldn't hesitate. Trunsost bore no ill will toward Amonizes for this. It was simply unnecessary. He was merely curious about the nature of the cooperation and deals between this goddess and Lynn. If she had indeed noticed his intention to switch sides, what would her attitude be? Perhaps she wouldn't oppose it. As these thoughts swirled in his mind, Lynn waved at them and his body gradually faded away, clearly using his travel ability to leave. With him, Mr. Door, Azek, and Artisan also departed. The other angels and high-sequence beings finally began to move. Although they were about to arrive in just a few moments, before they could reach their destination, Akasis, who had been lying on the ground, gritted his teeth and got up. He immediately looked at the Evernight goddess beside him and said, "Evernight, please conceal me." Amonizes glanced at Akasis. She naturally knew why he made such a request. As a Sequence 0, he still had some pride. Showing this level of humiliation in front of peers of the same rank was one thing, but he didn't want to show such a disgraceful appearance in front of other angels or even saints. However, while she understood, the Evernight goddess did not act immediately. Instead, she said seriously, "You have a very special corruption clinging to you, likely from that person. I can't guarantee that concealing you under these circumstances won't have adverse effects." Her words were spoken with such righteousness and sincerity, seemingly all for Akas's benefit. Akas's eyes widened in response, and just as he was about to say something, the group of angels and saints finally arrived, loudly and bustling. Akas's had no time to ask the Evernight goddess for concealment anymore. Even if it might worsen his injuries, he immediately transformed into a glowing ball, like a mini sun, and streaked across the skies above Backland, heading straight for his divine kingdom. Seeing this, Amonizes couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. The group that had arrived noisily stopped beside the Evernight goddess and the others. They stared at the dazzling figure in the sky, and one of them hesitantly asked, "Was that just now His Majesty the Eternal Blazing Sun?" Impossible, that was clearly a beaten pig. How could he be His Majesty the Eternal Blazing Sun? Ahem, don't speak nonsense. Clearly, as high-sequence beings, some of them had sharp eyesight. Hearing these hushed discussions, the Evernight goddess couldn't help but slightly curl her lips and then said, "You may all return now. The matter is over. Remember, try not to speak of today's events." Trunsost and the Lord of Storms, meanwhile, struggled to hold back their laughter. This time, the Eternal Blazing Sun had indeed suffered a great misfortune. Not only had he been thoroughly beaten, but his dignity was likely beyond repair. It wouldn't even take until tomorrow. Within half an hour, the news of the Eternal Blazing Sun being beaten into a pulp would spread throughout the high-sequence circles. While ordinary angels and demigods wouldn't dare to mock the Eternal Blazing Sun, others might not be so restrained. While Akas's was nursing his wounds and reputation, Lynn had already returned to the Abraham family's base and didn't rush to deal with the uniqueness of the Paragon. Instead, he turned to the deeply shocked Azek and smiled, saying, "Azek, after today's events, you should have a clear understanding of my strength. How about joining me? Following that deadbeat dad of yours leads nowhere. He clearly intends to use you as a tool and a resurrection vessel. I'm different. I only need you to work for me, and I guarantee your physical and mental health and safety." End of chapter. Lynn was undoubtedly serious when he spoke. He genuinely hoped Azek would join him and sincerely believed that Salinger, the god of death, was a terrible father. As for ensuring his mental and physical health, although Lynn admitted that working for him might be tiring, especially given the current state of the True Creator's Church, which lacked capable individuals. Perhaps in the future, as things developed, the various positions within the True Creator's Church would be filled with talent. But in the current early stages, where there were only a few people, Lynn clearly relied on the few capable individuals, including Azek and Artisan, to maintain the church's operations through sheer effort. For Lynn, this also served as a preliminary testing phase. He could first experiment with his ideas within the true Creator's church to see how a church should be run. This way, whether he later took over the church of the god of steam and machinery or started a church of his own, he could follow the model he established here. Azek, of course, had no idea what kind of overtime hell awaited him. But even if he knew, he probably wouldn't care too much. After all, the workload as the Death Consul in the Balam Empire was no less demanding than managing a church. After listening to Lynn's invitation, Azek fell silent, or rather, began to contemplate. This wasn't the first time Lynn had extended an invitation, but it was the first time he had been so straightforward. Nor was it the first time Azek had considered such matters. Ever since he first met Lynn and was persuaded by him, Azek had been pondering his future. He had been lost, had moments of unwillingness, and had even resigned himself to his fate. But then, at some point, Lynn, who had suddenly appeared, had pulled him out of that dark palace. Azek had long been swayed, and during these days, although brief, they had been incredibly eventful. He had contemplated his future many times, envisioned various possibilities, and now it was time to make a decision. As he thought about this, Azek looked up at Lynn. The young angel's smile was gentle, with a hint of expectation, making it impossible to believe that he had just done something earth-shattering not long ago. "I think it's time for a change of job," Azek said with a relieved smile. "I just hope my father won't be too angry." He still didn't want to return to that palace, to that cage. Azek no longer wished to be the Death Consul of the Balam Empire, to become the vessel for the resurrection of the god of death, nor to be a mere tool confined to a palace, handling mundane matters. "Don't worry, leave Salinger to me. We'll end up as enemies eventually," Lynn said, patting Azek on the shoulder with a smile tugging at his lips. He had finally recruited Azek, a prime candidate, into his garden. Hearing this, Azek's expression became somewhat subtle. He couldn't help but recall the events of the past few days. In all fairness, the journey with Lynn to the Trunsost Empire hadn't been long. From the perspective of the centuries Azek had lived as the Death Consul, those few days were as fleeting as a moment. But in those few days, Azek had experienced more than he had in hundreds or thousands of years. During his time as the Death Consul in the Loan Empire, Azek had never imagined he would one day pretend to be Mr. Door's brother, sneak into the Trunsost Empire's palace, carry a cage containing a miniature version of Amon, and witness the eternal blazing sun being beaten like a dog. It was certainly thrilling, but Azek sincerely felt his heart couldn't take much more. Ahem. Azek coughed lightly, then said tactfully, "I believe you can handle it, but it's better to avoid direct conflict if possible." "What, you don't want to see him get beaten?" Lynn glanced at Azek, surprised. If you said Azek had feelings for his descendants and for Klein, Lynn would believe it, but if you said Azek had feelings for that deadbeat father, Salinger, Lynn would be genuinely shocked. "Not really." Azek shook his head honestly, sighed, and said with concern, "I'm just worried about you. You're already at odds with His Majesty Tudor, and now you're completely antagonistic towards the eternal blazing sun if you also become enemies with the god of death. I believe you're not afraid of them, but this could cause trouble for you. I do want to escape the god of death, and I certainly want your help, but I don't want to push you into danger because of it," Azek said seriously. Although they hadn't known each other for long, after all they'd been through, Azek had already considered Lynn his only friend. So Azek didn't want Lynn to be in danger because of him. Lynn was taken aback, then he smiled brightly, a smile full of joy. "Azek, your nature hasn't changed at all. Even 1,000 years ago, the Death Consul had a strong sense of loyalty and righteousness. The influence of the god of death and the suppression of divinity had clouded his humanity, but they couldn't completely erase his true nature." Azek was momentarily stunned by Lynn's words, lost in thought. Lynn, meanwhile, rubbed his chin and said, "You have a point. Although I'm not afraid of them, antagonizing 3 sequence zeros at once would be challenging." Lynn's gaze fell on Azek, as if contemplating something. A few seconds later, he said, "Azek, would you be willing to give up your current identity?" Azek looked at him, puzzled, then smiled and said, "I've never been attached to it." "Good." Lynn nodded, his expression unusually serious. "Then let's kill the past you." Azek was taken aback, then seemed to realize something and said, You mean faking my death to escape? Or perhaps truly dying once to shed my old identity? It's possible, but my bloodline with the god of death is connected. Even if I die, he might still sense me after I revive, and he has also set up some arrangements within me. Don't worry, I'll take care of that, Lynn said confidently, patting his chest. Remember the power I used on the eternal blazing sun? Isaac was once again surprised. Lynn continued, I can use that same power on you, fixing the state of death on you in a false form. This won't affect your real condition but will block Salinger's perception of you. To him, you'll always be dead. As for the other arrangements, I can help you remove them as well. Is that even possible? Isaac was clearly stunned, not having expected such an approach. End of chapter. Of course, you can. In fact, this is just a small technique. The only downside is that I need to replenish this state on you from time to time, but that's not a big deal. Lynn smiled and nodded, looking at Isaac. But with this, you can no longer return to the Balam Empire. Although Salinger won't be able to sense you, if you run into someone familiar, this could get exposed. Hearing this, Isaac's expression turned melancholy for a moment, but then he smiled and said, That's fine. After all, there's nothing there that could make him linger, whether people or things. This wasn't because Isaac was heartless, but because the Balam Empire hadn't brought him any pleasant memories, neither the people nor the objects. All of Isaac's memories of that place consisted of dark palaces, endless work, punishments from the god of death, timid and distant servants, jealous and isolating siblings, and ministers who were humble yet cold. Isaac even vaguely remembered whether he had ever seen sunlight in that palace. Hey, snap out of it. Suddenly, someone waved an arm in front of him. Isaac snapped back to reality, seeing Lynn's bright smile. Well, let's not waste any time. Let's plan how to give your despicable father a surprise. Thus, a day later, in the palace of the Balam Empire, far on the southern continent. The god of death, Salinger, suddenly raised his head and looked in a particular direction. In that instant, he sensed that Isaac, who shared his bloodline, had suddenly fallen, along with the safeguards Salinger had placed on him. This sudden event caused Salinger to frown. He wouldn't feel sad over the death of a bloodline descendant, but he was indeed a bit angry. Not because of anything else, but because Isaac's fall not only meant that he had to choose another death consul for the Balam Empire but also that all the arrangements he had made for Isaac were in vain. That was supposed to be his designated resurrection vessel. Who on earth dared? Salinger's expression darkened. He then muttered a curse under his breath, worthless. It was unclear who this insult was aimed at. Someone, come here. Salinger suddenly calmed down. He called out softly, and a servant appeared in the palace, kneeling before him. Go to the Tudor Empire. I want to know what happened. The servant sent by the god of death, Salinger, failed to uncover what had happened in the Tudor Empire, but he brought back a somewhat special guest. I am truly sorry. It's all due to my negligence that Isaac fell into the cosmos and was captured by an outer god. Lynn stood in the center of the palace, his face full of regret. Beside him was Bethel, who had come to support him, and his expression also showed a hint of apology. Salinger listened to Lynn's explanation, his expression growing colder. He looked at Lynn and said, So, you and Isaac, along with Mr. Dorr, went to explore the cosmos together, but unfortunately encountered the mother goddess of depravity. While you and Mr. Dorr managed to escape, Isaac was captured? Though the process was a bit more complicated, that's essentially what happened. Lynn nodded heavily. Indeed, the script Lynn had devised for Isaac's fake death was just that. They went to explore the cosmos together, but unfortunately encountered an outer god. In the end, the two of them managed to escape, while Isaac tragically met his end. Though it sounded quite absurd, almost like a farce, when examined closely, it was a rather reasonable scenario. After all, Bethel did have a habit of exploring the cosmos, and there were indeed outer gods in the cosmos. If the three of them had truly encountered an outer god, Isaac was indeed the most likely to meet a tragic end. Hearing this, Salinger's expression grew even darker. His gaze swept over Lynn and Mr. Dorr with suspicion and doubt, but he said nothing. Salinger didn't outright believe Lynn's fabricated story, however, he didn't doubt Isaac's death, either. After all, both the bloodline connection and the safeguards he had placed on Isaac indicated that Isaac was truly dead. What Salinger suspected was whether Azek's death was an accident or if it was orchestrated by the father and son before him. Due to the intentional information blockade by the Night Emperor Trunsost, the Evernight Goddess, the Lord of Storms, and the seriously wounded Eternal Blazing Sun, the incident of Lynn severely injuring the Eternal Blazing Sun wasn't widely known. As a result, the God of Death, Salinger, only knew that something seemed to have happened in the Trunsost Empire, that the Eternal Blazing Sun was possibly attacked and gravely injured, but didn't know who the attacker was. I need an explanation. I entrusted Azek to you, not to get such a result, Salinger said, his cold gaze falling on Bethel. The Balaam Empire cannot bear the loss of a death consul, and I cannot accept that one of my children will forever remain in the cosmos. Lynn lowered his head at these words, no longer listening to the rest of Salinger's litany of accusations. He could see that, no matter what flowery words he spoke, the God of Death didn't genuinely feel any sorrow over Azek's death. Everything he said was just to maximize his own gains. A scumbag will always be a scumbag. Don't expect a scumbag to suddenly develop a conscience, Lynn muttered in his heart as he listened to Bethel begin to speak in an official tone, expressing that he was equally saddened by Azek's passing and was willing to compensate the Balaam Empire. Salinger wasn't surprised by Bethel's words. The two sides then began haggling over the compensation, and it wasn't until Lynn was practically dozing off that they finally reached an agreement. Bethel and Lynn would compensate the Balaam Empire with a Sequence 2 characteristic to make up for the loss, and Bethel would assist the God of Death, Salinger, once, without violating his principles. I will hold a funeral for Azek in half a month. I hope you will come to mourn my child, Salinger stated, now satisfied with the compensation. We will attend Azek's funeral, Bethel responded with a sad nod. Poor Azek, may he rest in peace in another world, Lynn sighed. After a few more hypocritical pleasantries, Lynn and Bethel bid farewell to the God of Death and returned to the Abraham family's residence. As soon as they returned, Lynn pretended to retch and complained, he's such a good actor. He talks about how much he loved Azek, but he didn't show an ounce of sorrow. Salinger is a heartless person, Bethel said, unsurprised. So he deserved to fail, Lynn retorted, then looked over at Azek, not far away, with a bright smile and said, It's done, Azek. Congratulations on your rebirth. Azek's expression faltered at these words, then he too smiled and said to Lynn, Please take care of me from now on. End of chapter. On one side, Azek finally escaped the grasp of death and gained a new life. Although he might soon have to work for Lynn and join 24/7 workforce, at least for this moment, Azek felt light and joyful. On the other side, after dealing with Azek's situation, Lynn finally had time to start researching the Paragon's uniqueness. Unlike the personified hidden sage, the Paragon's uniqueness doesn't have a true personality, but it still possesses a certain level of activity, similar to the Wheel of Fortune pathway's uniqueness, the probability dice. Since you have some level of activity, you should be able to understand what I'm saying to some extent. Lynn toyed with the Paragon's uniqueness in his hand. It looked like a book, with each page filled with text. However, the words were blurry, hard to discern, and seemed to shift at any moment. As Lynn's fingers brushed over the surface of the book, he could feel the pages tremble slightly under his touch. The entity was afraid. Clearly, just like other active sealed artifacts Lynn had encountered before, the Paragon's uniqueness instinctively feared Lynn. In fact, its reaction was even stronger than those of 008 and other entities. Why are you scared? I won't eat you. Well, maybe you should be scared. Lynn almost instinctively made a sarcastic remark and, remembering that he was indeed going to absorb the Paragon's uniqueness, added the latter half of his sentence. Then, he eagerly began to study the Paragon's uniqueness's functions. Let's see what you can actually do. Assisting the user in crafting high-sequence sealed artifact, and even directly mass-producing mid- to low-sequence Beander characteristics into sealed artifact. Mass-producing Beander weapons. Tisk, what a logistics artifact. This could arm an entire army single-handedly. Lynn rubbed his chin, muttering as he nodded in satisfaction. He had been lacking such logistical items, so he was more than pleased with the Paragon's uniqueness's abilities. It can record the enlightenment and development of civilization, and then use these recorded histories to both defend against attacks and launch them against others, similar to the move Artisan used in the original work. Though it seems to be a weaker version. Lynn continued researching its other functions and was suddenly taken aback. Wait, it can also enlighten people in a region? The range is about half the size of Backland, and it can make the people in that area smarter, think faster, learn more quickly, and be more prone to bursts of inspiration in the future. Damn, with this ability, how did Artisan not max out the tech tree after over 1,000 years? Lynn was truly shocked. Although this ability had no direct offensive power, it was absolutely a divine skill in terms of advancing civilization. Often, a breakthrough in technology comes down to a single flash of inspiration. With such an artifact in hand, how did Artisan manage to hold back technological progress for over 1,000 years without unlocking new advancements? Could it be that this skill was never actually used? Maybe Artisan never realized the importance of this skill. Lynn was momentarily at a loss for words, shaking his head in disbelief as he continued to explore the Paragon's uniqueness's other functions, leading to its final ability. It can analyze biological information and provide the most suitable enhancement plan based on different situations, assist in modifying organisms, and analyze various details of items. If the relevant knowledge is provided, it can even automatically suggest various applications for that knowledge. Good grief, isn't this basically a tech synthesis tree, gambling on blueprints? The more Lynn read, the more excited he became. This last ability, in simpler terms, was like a personal status screen, allowing someone to see their situation most clearly and point them toward the most suitable path. While it might seem useless at first glance, it was actually incredibly practical. And it could even be used to gamble on blueprints. To give a simple example, if Lynn inputted knowledge about electricity into the Paragon's uniqueness, along with various materials for crafting engines, the Paragon's uniqueness could potentially gamble out the entire tech tree for that area, directly analyzing and revealing the various ways to make engines. Though this ability had its limitations, if the input knowledge was too sparse, like trying to invent a steam engine without understanding its basic principles, it would be hard to unlock the blueprint. It was still incredibly powerful. Especially for a transmigrator who knows a bit about many things, this artifact was practically a godsend for stacking up technological advancements. Of course, Lynn had a realistic understanding of his own limitations. While he knew a fair amount of principles, his knowledge was still limited. With just this small amount of information, it would be hard to fully unlock a tech tree. But Russell certainly knew more than him. After all, Russell was a genius capable of spearheading an industrial revolution. Lynn believed that Russell's knowledge base was much broader than his own. So, with all these skills, how did Artisan fail to advance technology over a span of 1,000 years? Was he asleep all that time? Lynn couldn't help but show a puzzled expression. While it was difficult to randomly generate blueprints in areas like steam and machinery without the proper knowledge, after so many years, couldn't Artisan at least have used their knowledge to create some useful blueprints that could lead to a technological revolution? Or perhaps Artisan didn't fail to unlock the blueprints but instead focused all their skills on personal combat? Lynn suddenly thought of another possibility, and his expression turned more complex. There's no doubt that the Paragon's uniqueness doesn't possess overwhelming combat power. From this, one can infer that the Paragon itself is probably not a combat-oriented sequence zero like the Lord of Storms, but rather more of a support and logistics type. Of course, this doesn't mean the Paragon is weak, just that its initial combat abilities are low, much like how a mystery prior pathway can become stronger by learning secret knowledge and analyzing various Beander abilities. The Paragon could also grow stronger by crafting sealed artifact and modifying itself, meaning it has a low starting point but a very high potential ceiling. However, it's well known that the Beander realm is one of the survival of the fittest, especially at the sequence 0 level. In this realm, unless you have a strong and reliable backer, being a support type won't get you far. So, considering this, it's possible that Artisan spent those years enhancing personal combat power rather than advancing technology. End of chapter. But isn't this putting the cart before the horse? The potion hasn't been digested yet, so what good is modifying oneself? Lynn shook his head. He was too lazy to even criticize Artisan for wasting such resources. If only a more knowledgeable transmigrator had become a Paragon, just these few skills over 1,000 years could have advanced the technology tree to modern levels. Alright, I have to consider external factors. After all, this is a world with gods. Even if you want to focus on developing agriculture and technology, the other true gods wouldn't just let you slowly build up. After all, Sequences 0 aren't fools. Thinking this way, it's understandable why Artisan has done so little. Lynn muttered. However, he was extremely satisfied with the uniqueness of the paragon he had obtained. Although this artifact didn't enhance his offensive capabilities, Lynn didn't need that. What he needed was something that could develop civilization, advance the technology tree, and ensure logistics. Why couldn't Russell be in the fourth epoch? Lynn suddenly felt a pang of frustration. He was eager to use the Emperor's knowledge reserve to gamble for blueprints. Even if the chances of success were low, over time, he might be able to push the technology tree to modern levels. Wait, I can directly ask Russell of the fifth epoch. Even though I have to go through a few hands, knowledge can be passed down several times without much loss. Besides, Russell is idle now anyway, so why not help me push the technology tree? Lynn's eyes lit up. He couldn't wait to transfer his main consciousness back to his larger body in the fifth epoch and immediately called Russell. However, after the call connected, Lynn was disappointed by the news he received from Russell. So, even though you've regained consciousness and suppressed the corrupted persona, the damage to your soul and mind from the corruption hasn't healed, causing you to lose part of your memory, including this knowledge? Lynn's expression could be described as gnashing his teeth as he spoke. Ahem. There's nothing I can do about that. In fact, not only have I lost these memories, but I've also lost a lot of others. Only the most important ones are still intact. Russell coughed lightly, sounding a bit guilty. Then what good are you to me? Lynn puffed up his cheeks in anger. Without Russell's knowledge pack, did he have to rely on the few scraps of knowledge he knew to gamble for blueprints? How long would that take? You could start by advancing steam and machinery. You can directly acquire this knowledge in this era. Russell suggested gently. Though he wasn't sure what Lynn was planning, he could guess that Lynn wanted to push for a technological revolution in some era. I guess that's all I can do. I thought I could push the technology tree to modern levels in one go. Lynn sighed wistfully. Actually, if you could descend in the era when I first transmigrated, you might be able to get a lot of knowledge from me back then. I used to love studying these things. Russell suggested after some thought, his expression also tinged with nostalgia. Even though I don't remember the specific knowledge now, I dare say that if the industrial base of this era wasn't so poor, I might have developed something like a mobile phone back then. Even if it couldn't be mass-produced, it might have been possible to create a few rare items with limited functionality, combining the extraordinary abilities of this world. This wasn't entirely boasting. Russell had indeed considered creating mobile phones before, but the gap between steam technology and information technology was too great. The difficulty was almost equivalent to crafting a nuclear bomb by hand, so he had to give up in the end. But that would require me to be able to descend in the first place. I haven't fully mastered this ability yet. Lynn muttered to himself. Normally, he wouldn't be so eager to push the technology tree to modern levels. After all, Lynn understood that progress had to be made step by step. However, Lynn had just acquired the Paragon's uniqueness, this great toy, and was in high spirits. Naturally, he was feeling a bit impatient. Actually, I'm looking forward to seeing you push the technology tree to modern levels. Russell's expression showed a hint of longing and nostalgia, likely recalling his life before his transmigration. Life with air conditioning, computers, and video sites is true happiness. Do you want a soda with that? Lynn glanced at him and asked. That would be perfect. Russell answered seriously. All right. Who am I if not a kind boss? Lynn said, using the historical projection skill he had analyzed from Antigonus. He had just pulled out 2 sodas from the gaps of history when he suddenly froze. What's wrong? Russell asked, puzzled. Lynn handed one of the sodas to him, took a sip of his own, and then, while stroking his chin, said, Do you think it's possible to dismantle a historical projection? Russell was momentarily stunned, then his eyes widened. He could guess what Lynn wanted to do, summon things like computers and mobile phones from history and then take them apart for research. This was something Russell had never considered before. Even when he imagined how he might use historical projections as a seer, he only thought about summoning a computer to play games. He never thought of dismantling and studying it. But he had to admit, this idea sounded feasible. Why don't we give it a try? Russell suggested, his expression also filled with anticipation. He was curious to see if historical projections could be dismantled. So the two began their experiment. Half an hour later, They had both good news and bad news. The good news was that historical projections could indeed be dismantled, and it seemed there wasn't much difference between dismantling them and dismantling real objects. The bad news was that although the Paragon's uniqueness provided some information from analyzing the historical projection, it wasn't enough. If they wanted to create the corresponding items, they'd need a solid foundation of related knowledge in addition to analyzing the historical projections. So, I'll still need your knowledge pack to fill in the missing information if I want to push the technology tree forward. Lynn concluded, stroking his chin while giving Russell a resentful look. Ahem. Well, you'll have to work hard for that. Russell looked away guiltily. Sigh. Lynn sighed, chatted with Russell for a bit longer, and then hung up the call. He stretched, about to contact Ouroboros to check on the preparations when he suddenly glanced at the door thoughtfully. Lynn sensed two presences, one belonging to Klein, and the other to Azek. End of chapter. Lynn wasn't surprised by Klein and Azek's arrival. After all, he knew very well the major events he had caused during the fourth epoch. Considering that Azek could synchronously receive memories from that period, it would have been strange if he hadn't come to find him. In fact, even if Azek hadn't taken the initiative to visit, Lynn had already planned to contact him later. Lynn wanted to observe whether the fourth epoch Azek, who was supposed to be free from the shackles of the death god after faking his death, would still influence the fifth epoch Azek or if the impact would be minimal, similar to how Lynn had helped Medici revive. Despite his curiosity, as a professional actor, Lynn didn't let any of his thoughts slip through. Instead, he appropriately displayed a look of confusion. When he opened the door, he feigned surprise as he looked at the two men standing there. Klein and Mr. Azek, what brings you here? Lynn's surprise was so genuine that it seemed flawless. He first glanced at Klein and murmured, Klein, I remember you took on a job today, serving as a bodyguard for a reporter on a covert mission to the East Borough, didn't you? That's right. The story had already reached the point of Klein's East Borough journey. According to the original plot, Klein was supposed to accompany reporter Mike to the East Borough, where he would also encounter Old Kohler, who would later become one of Klein's informants. Everything seemed to be moving towards a better life, but it was cut short by the thick fog and the subsequent calamity. I've already been to the East Borough with reporter Mike. Over there. Sigh, Klein sighed, his expression becoming somewhat wistful. Mr. Azek, who was beside Klein, looked at him with interest. During this trip to the East Borough, he hadn't encountered any danger, but he had witnessed a side of this world that was completely different from the era he was familiar with. A dark side composed of the poor who could collapse at any moment. Klein sighed because of them, yet he couldn't change their circumstances. It was truly terrible. The East Borough, Lynn pursed his lips. He could clearly see why Klein sighed, and he wasn't surprised. After pondering for a few seconds, he said, perhaps one day, we can change that. The abilities of the planter pathway could develop agriculture, and advancing the technology tree to modern levels could ensure productivity. Lynn didn't dare to say he could create a utopian world. That was too difficult, and he never overestimated his abilities. But as long as productivity improved and food production increased, with well-crafted rules and proper supervision, it should be possible to prevent people from starving, right? So, I do need Russell's knowledge bundle. Of course, the attitudes of other Sequence 0s are also an issue. They certainly wouldn't want me to push the technology tree forward, but that's okay. I'm not artisan, Lynn muttered to himself, his smile becoming brighter. Artisan might be restricted by the seven gods and unable to develop technology due to various reasons, but Lynn wasn't afraid. Even if Mr. Bubbles were to go against the world, he won't back down. Change it? Klein was stunned for a moment, then looked at Lynn in surprise. Suddenly, he smiled and said, it sounds difficult, but his eyes brightened. Changing this era? To be honest, Klein had never seriously considered it today. Or rather, the thought had occasionally crossed his mind while watching the impoverished and hungry people on the streets, but it had always been suppressed, because it seemed impossible. The fool knew he didn't have the power to change an entire era yet. He couldn't even take care of himself properly and could only help others within his limited capacity. Just like hiring Old Kohler as his informant this time, Klein didn't really need such an informant, but he was willing to help the poor old man within his capabilities. But that's all he could do. After all, Klein was just a Sequence 7 at the moment and was dirt poor, so his options were limited. But if the opportunity arose, if he had the power, Klein wouldn't mind giving it a try. No worries. We might as well give it a shot. He said we're the saviors, didn't he? Even if we're too low in sequence now to do much, we can still do what we can. When we get stronger, maybe we'll really be able to change this era, Lynn said with a smile, clearly very optimistic. But as he spoke, his expression became more subtle. Do you think it's feasible to turn the Aurora Order into a charity organization? Huh? This time, Klein was genuinely dumbfounded, momentarily wondering if he had misheard. I shouldn't have misheard, right? Did you just say to turn the Aurora Order into a charity? This doubt made Klein pause before he looked at Lynn and asked. You didn't mishear, Lynn said, showing some hesitation. You know I had some connections with the true creator. So, Klein, of course, knew about Lynn's complicated history with the true creator, though he wasn't yet aware that the nature of this entanglement had evolved. Still, it didn't change the fact that Lynn had a deep connection with the true creator. Well, it's something that happened yesterday. The Angel of Secrets approached me again. He said he wanted to transform the Aurora Order from a terrorist organization into a secret organization aligned with Order. Then he handed me control of the Backland branch of the Aurora Order. As Lynn spoke, he spread his hands and said helplessly, his idea is for me to manage and restrain this part of the Aurora Order, guiding them to do good and atone for their past sins. Although Ouroboros had yet to bring the message, Lynn believed that the Backland branch of the Aurora Order would certainly be handed over to him by the true creator. This kind of confidence was something the little brat still had. Klein was dumbfounded. He had countless comments to make but held back for a long time before finally saying, didn't he deny that the true creator was his acquaintance? I don't know. Maybe he later admitted it again. After all, we only got part of the early diary. Lynn spread his hands, looking innocent. If it's about this, perhaps I know a little information. Isaac, who had remained silent during the conversation, finally spoke up. His gaze was warm yet complex as it landed on Lynn, filled with indescribable emotion. Huh? Lynn was initially surprised, then seemed to realize something and awkwardly said, sorry, Mr. Isaac, I got so caught up in the conversation that I forgot you were here. As he said this, Lynn's eyes quickly scanned Isaac, confirming a fact. Isaac's soul had not been fully restored, and he still only had half of his soul. It was clear that, although Isaac should theoretically no longer suffer soul fragmentation due to the death god's influence, just like how Medici, who should not have remained in limbo after his resurrection, Isaac hadn't been affected by a butterfly effect. Honestly, it was strange, but Lynn had long been accustomed to such bizarre temporal structures and could now accept them calmly. End of chapter. Lynn speculated that if he truly wanted to repair Isaac's fractured soul, he would either have to act in the fifth epic or wait until the point in the original story where the god of death splits Isaac's soul. Ensuring that event doesn't occur would directly affect Isaac's future state. Just as in the fourth epic, Artisan, who had followed Lynn for a while, was still the god of steam and machinery in this era. With Lynn by his side, it was theoretically impossible for Bethel to be captured by an outer god and turned into a puppet. Bethel was still drifting in outer space. Although Lynn's changes to these individuals would directly affect them, they were limited to direct alterations, such as granting or removing a characteristic. These changes would manifest across time and space on the person themselves. However, changes like altering someone's fate prematurely, causing a butterfly effect, wouldn't directly change the fate of the individuals in the future. But when you think about it, it's not surprising. If butterfly effects were to happen constantly, the timeline would be filled with endless anomalies based on the things I've done. Instead, these minor, direct changes that erase butterfly effects might actually stabilize the overall structure. At least, only the parts I've changed are altered, avoiding significant bugs, Lynn muttered to himself, further understanding his peculiar time-related abilities. Lynn had a vague feeling that the powers he inherited from his true self were mainly reflected in time and history. He might have other abilities too, possibly including the miraculous time-related powers he could use by borrowing strength from his true self. But he'd forgotten the manual. This was frustrating. Without a manual, he could only rely on his abilities passively. The key issue is whether there even is a manual. Did the entity really remember to give me one? Lynn fell into deep thought. It wasn't the first time he'd had this doubt. Otherwise, why hadn't he found even a trace of the manual? Never mind. Isaac wasn't aware of how far Lynn's thoughts had wandered in such a short time. Isaac simply shook his head, his expression still gentle. He looked at Lynn, the young and somewhat shy detective in front of him, while images of a young angel who took him to Trunsost, captured Amon, beat up the eternal blazing sun, and helped him fake his death to escape a life like being in a cage, flashed through his mind. Their appearances were undoubtedly similar, though there were subtle differences, likely due to the age gap. The detective before him looked older. But the feelings they gave Isaac were completely different. The young angel was too flamboyant and unrestrained. In his life dictionary, there were clearly no words like retreat or setback. He lived as intensely and brilliantly as the sun. Lynn Soto's, on the other hand, seemed much weaker. He didn't have the young angel's flamboyance or recklessness. He would bring Klein along as a bodyguard out of fear of danger and carry a bunch of scrolls to prevent accidents. Yet, Isaac didn't believe they were two different people. Although their personalities differed, their essence was incredibly similar. "I've remembered a lot of things, about you, about me, about the past." Isaac began slowly, his voice calm but tinged with some melancholy and nostalgia. "It seems you have a lot to tell me." Lynn immediately looked at him with curiosity. Even though he had been pondering the issue of the manual a moment ago, he quickly shifted into character, fully engaged in the present moment. Regarding acting, Lynn was a professional. Klein naturally recalled the original purpose of his visit with Mr. Isaac to find Lynn and also looked at Isaac with curiosity. Because they had arrived in a hurry, Isaac hadn't had time to tell Klein what exactly he had remembered. Thus, Mr. Fool only knew that Mr. Isaac seemed to have recalled many important things, but not exactly what they were. However, before Isaac could begin his narration, Lynn seemed to think of something and stepped aside, saying, "Hey, don't just stand at the door, come in and talk. I'll pour you some tea. Do you want coffee or tea? Sherlock, you don't need to answer. I know you drink coffee." "Tea will be fine." Isaac's carefully prepared emotions were interrupted, leaving him somewhat amused, but he also felt a growing sense of familiarity with the young detective. In those recently recovered memories, which to him were no different from actual experiences, the young angel was also like this. Passionate and with a subtle touch of everyday life. He would seriously ask him and Mr. Dorr what they wanted to drink while discussing important matters, complain about Mr. Dorr's terrible cooking, and he even tried to feed tiny Amon with grains and leaves like a hamster. Ahem, maybe not the last one. But the mini Amon really did look like a hamster when fed. Isaac worked hard to steer his memories away from the strange direction they were heading. After entering the room, he followed Klein into the living room. Klein, familiar with the place, invited him to sit on the sofa and instinctively pulled out a newspaper from under the coffee table. After glancing at it, he seemed to realize something and quickly stuffed the newspaper back. "If you want to read, just read it. It's not like it's the first time you've read a newspaper at my place. After all, we've gotten used to visiting each other's places," Lynn said as he poured tea or coffee for all three of them, finally sitting down comfortably opposite Klein. "Ahem, it's just that we're about to discuss serious matters." Klein cleared his throat lightly and muttered softly, "It was just muscle memory." After that, Mr. Fool took a sip of his coffee and waited for Mr. Isaac to speak. Lynn also looked at Isaac. "I haven't recovered many memories, and they're somewhat chaotic. Some of the memories are in conflict, or perhaps not exactly in conflict. It might just be that I haven't recovered enough." Isaac began to narrate slowly, not disappointing them. After listening to his description, Lynn understood that Isaac's current memory state was akin to a mess. The memories he had lost and were now recovering were intertwined with the new memories created by the changes Lynn had made to history. In simple terms, Isaac was receiving a set of memories from the altered history every so often. Meanwhile, he was also constantly recovering his true past memories, which led to a mixture of the two sets of memories. Although these two sets of memories had differences, for someone with amnesia like Isaac, it was evidently difficult to distinguish them. This caused the memories he had recently recovered to be somewhat chaotic, which had left him a bit disoriented and delayed his visit to Lynn. After hearing Isaac's explanation, Lynn couldn't help but feel a genuine sense of pity for the amnesiac in front of him. Gaining memories from altered history might be just an extra life for others, at most influenced by the emotions attached to those memories, or, like Ouroboros, They might simply accept them as part of their life without any confusion. But for someone like Isaac, who had amnesia and was continually recovering his memories, this was clearly a torment. Especially when these memories conflicted with each other. Lynn figured Isaac must have been thoroughly bewildered. How pitiful. End of chapter.